She is standing in a doorway. The year is 2024. Somewhere in America, a bride in white is laughing as her new husband bends down and lifts her off the ground. He carries her across the threshold of their home. The guests behind them cheer. Someone takes a photograph. The moment is perfect. The moment is romantic. The moment is a tradition that stretches back further than anyone in that doorway could possibly imagine. 2,700 years further back. Now rewind that image. Strip away the white dress. Strip away the laughter. Strip away the guests and the champagne and the photographer. Replace them with torchlight. Replace the laughter with screaming. Replace the doorway of a home that was chosen with the doorway of a house that has never been seen before. Replace the husband with a stranger. Replace the carrying with dragging. Replace the bride with a captive. That gesture you just imagine, the one you have seen at weddings your entire life, the one you may have performed yourself, was enacted for the first time approximately 2,750 years ago. The bride was not laughing. She was clawing at the dirt trying to break free. And the man carrying her was not her husband. He was a stranger who had been specifically assigned to deliver her to another stranger. What you think of as romance is a reenactment, and I can prove every word of it because the Romans wrote it all down. Her name was Hersilia. The year was approximately 750 years before the Common Era. She was roughly 20 years old, the daughter of a respected Sabine family, and on the morning that would change everything, she had no reason to be afraid. Her father, a man of standing in the Sabine community, had decided to take his family to a festival. A new settlement on the hills to the south had sent out invitations. The settlement was called Rome. The festival honored a god named Consus, a deity of stored grain and agricultural abundance. The invitation promised games, spectacles, entertainment, the kind of celebration that a growing community stages when it wants to impress its neighbors. It specifically mentioned that women and children would find much to enjoy. Hersilia went because her father wanted to go. She went because the game sounded interesting. She went because she had heard stories about this new settlement and was curious to see it for herself. Her younger sister came along as well, a girl of perhaps 15, excited about the horse races she had been promised. They traveled with a larger group of Sabine families, dozens of them, walking the road south with their children and their best clothing, and the comfortable assumption that a religious festival meant safety. Because bringing violence to a celebration honoring the gods was unthinkable. Because no one would desecrate a sacred occasion with aggression. Because the invitation had come with the implied protection of divine law. They did not know they were walking into a trap designed with military precision by men who had already decided their fate. But before I tell you what happened to Hersilia that day, I need you to understand what Rome actually was in the year 750 before the Common Era. Because it was not what you learned in school. It was not a gleaming city of marble and ambition. It was not the foundation of an empire. Not yet. In its earliest years, Rome was something much stranger and much more dangerous than that. The traditional story says Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers, raised by a wolf. Romulus killed Remus in a dispute over whose vision would prevail, and then he built a city on the Palatine Hill. That much most people know. What the traditional story does not emphasize, what gets quietly left out of the version taught in classrooms, is what kind of people populated that first settlement. The historian Livy, writing centuries later, described early Rome in terms that made his Roman audience deeply uncomfortable. He said that Romulus established what he called an asylum. Not a city, not a kingdom. An asylum. A refuge. A place where anyone could come regardless of background, regardless of what they had done, regardless of what they were running from. And Livy did not soften the picture of who answered this invitation. Runaway slaves seeking freedom from masters who would hunt them forever. Men fleeing murder charges in their home communities. Debtors who had borrowed more than they could ever repay and faced imprisonment or worse. Exiles who had been expelled from respectable societies for crimes that Livy does not specify but clearly considers serious. The desperate, the criminal, the unwanted, the men that every other society in central Italy had rejected. This was Rome's founding population. Not noble warriors, not heroic pioneers building a shining city. The refuse of a dozen communities gathered on a cluster of muddy hills by a man who promised them land and citizenship and a fresh start. And to be fair to Romulus, it worked. The population grew rapidly. Within a few years, Rome had become a genuine settlement with real buildings and organized streets and a military force that neighboring peoples could not ignore. Thousands of men had gathered on those hills, drawn by the promise of a new beginning, by the opportunity to own property, by the chance to be citizens instead of outcasts. But something was wrong, something fundamental, something that threatened to end everything Rome had built within a single generation. Almost all of these refugees were men. Rome had soldiers, Rome had farmers, Rome had builders and craftsmen, and all the labor a growing settlement required. What Rome did not have, what Rome could not acquire, no matter how attractive it made itself to refugees and runaways, was women. And without women, there would be no children. Without children, there would be no second generation. The first generation of Romans would also be the last. Everything Romulus had built would disappear within decades. The hills would be reclaimed by neighboring peoples who were already watching, already waiting, already counting the years until Rome solved its own extinction. Rome was not facing an enemy army. Rome was facing arithmetic. And arithmetic does not negotiate. Romulus understood this. He understood it with the cold clarity of a man who had killed his own brother to build something and could see that something dying before his eyes. And so he tried diplomacy first. He sent ambassadors to every neighboring people within reach. The Sabines, the largest and closest. The Latins to the south. The Canaanenses, the Crustumerians, the Antemnates. His ambassadors carried formal proposals for alliance and intermarriage. They asked these neighbors to allow their daughters to marry Roman men, to blend families, to build connections between communities, the way peoples had done across Italy for generations. Every single embassy was rejected, and the rejections were not polite. They were contemptuous. The neighbors looked at this settlement of criminals and runaways and saw exactly what it was. They saw the last men on earth any father would want his daughter to marry. Livy records that some of them mocked the Roman ambassadors openly. They asked why Rome had not thought to open an asylum for criminal women as well. That way the Romans could find suitable matches among their own kind. This was not merely disinterest. This was strategy. The neighboring peoples understood the mathematics just as well as Romulus did. If they simply refused to provide women, Rome would die. The settlement would collapse within a generation. The territory would become available again. The threat would disappear without anyone having to risk a single soldier. Demographic strangulation. Kill Rome not with swords, but with time. Romulus received the final rejection. Livy says he concealed his resentment. He showed nothing on his face. He thanked the ambassadors for their honesty, and then he gathered his advisors behind closed doors and asked them a question that would change the course of Western civilization. If our neighbors will not give us their daughters willingly, how else might we acquire them? The answer they developed would require a religious festival, a carefully crafted invitation, and approximately one night of coordinated violence against unarmed civilians. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand exactly how it was planned. Because this was not a riot. This was not chaos. This was not young men getting drunk and losing control. What happened was a military operation organized with the same precision that Rome would later use to conquer the Mediterranean world. And at the center of that operation was a single invitation. The invitation went out to every neighboring people within traveling distance. It announced a grand festival in honor of Consus. It promised games and spectacles of a quality that Rome had never before offered. It specifically encouraged families to attend. It specifically mentioned that women and children would find much to enjoy. And it specifically emphasized that this was a religious celebration where the peace of the gods would guarantee everyone's safety. But here is what the invitation did not mention. Before the festival even began, before the first guests arrived, Romulus had sent scouts into the arriving crowds. These scouts had a specific mission. They moved through the groups of visitors, observing, noting, cataloging. They identified the young unmarried women. They noted which ones were most beautiful. They reported back to Roman leadership with names and descriptions and locations within the crowd. The most desirable women were reserved for leading senators. Specific plebeians, lower-ranking men, were assigned to seize those specific women and deliver them to the houses of the men they had been reserved for. Livy records this detail with a precision that reveals how uncomfortable even he found it. Some particularly beautiful ones had been reserved for leading senators, and these were carried to their houses by plebeians who had been specifically assigned this task. I want you to hear that again. Specifically assigned this task. This was not spontaneous. This was procurement, with assignments, with delivery instructions, with a chain of command. The Sabines accepted the invitation. They lived closest to Rome and had the most direct interest in observing what this new settlement had become. They came in large numbers. They brought their families. They brought their unmarried daughters. Because what father would leave his daughter home alone when the whole family was traveling to a festival? Other neighboring peoples came as well. The Canaanenses, the Christumarians, the Antemnates. The invitation had been persuasive. The promise of entertainment was attractive, and perhaps some of them were curious to see whether the Roman settlement was really as impressive as rumors suggested. They arrived on the morning of the festival. Livy describes them walking through Roman streets, examining the layout, genuinely impressed by what they found. The buildings were substantial. The streets were organized. Whatever else you might say about these Roman outcasts, they had built something real. The Sabine families found spaces to sit. They arranged themselves comfortably. The children ran between the rows. The women talked among themselves. The men set aside their traveling gear. No one carried weapons because this was a religious festival, and bringing weapons to a celebration honoring the gods would have been a violation of sacred law. The games began: horse races, wrestling matches, athletic competitions. The crowd settled in, guards relaxed. The afternoon stretched on. The sun moved across the sky and began to drop toward the western hills. Shadows grew longer. Torches were lit as the light faded. The festival atmosphere deepened. Families were comfortable. Defenses were down. This is what the Romans were waiting for. I need you to understand what happened next was not spontaneous. It was not a riot that spiraled out of control. It was not passion or alcohol or excitement. What happened next was a military operation with specific objectives, specific assignments, and specific targets that had been identified hours or days before the festival even began. At a prearranged signal from Romulus himself, the Roman men moved. They moved simultaneously. They moved throughout the crowd. They moved towards specific targets, the young women, and they seized them. In the space of minutes, approximately 700 women were grabbed by men they had never met and dragged away from their families. The number varies in the ancient sources. Some say 30, some say hundreds. The most commonly accepted figure is approximately 700, predominantly Sabines, but including women from every neighboring people who had accepted the invitation. The visiting men tried to fight back. They had no weapons. They had come to a religious festival. They had trusted the sacred peace. They were helpless. They could only watch as their daughters and sisters were pulled from their arms and carried into the growing darkness by strangers. Hersilia was seized by one of the most prominent Romans. Some sources say Romulus himself took her. Others say it was Hostus Hostilius, one of the leading warriors of the settlement, a man whose grandson would one day become the third king of Rome. What every source agrees on is this: she was grabbed by men she had never spoken to. She was pulled away from her father. She saw her younger sister being dragged in a different direction by different men. She screamed her sister's name. Her father tried to reach her. He was unarmed. He was struck down. Hersilia heard her father calling her name as she was dragged away, and that was the last time she would hear his voice for months. She was carried through streets lit by torchlight. The Romans carried torches because the operation had been timed for twilight, when visibility was poor, and the visitor's confusion would be greatest. Hersilia saw the face of Hostus Hostilius for the first time in the flickering light of a torch he carried as he dragged her toward a house she had never seen. A stranger's face lit by fire pulling her into darkness. She was brought to a doorway. She was lifted off the ground. She was carried across the threshold. She was set down inside a room. The door closed behind her. The bar dropped into place. Outside, the screaming of other women continued, growing more distant as they were distributed throughout the settlement by strength. Inside, there was only Hersilia and the stranger and the closed door and the understanding that the world she had known that morning no longer existed. 700 women, seized in a single coordinated operation, carried through streets they did not know to houses they had never seen. And what happened to them inside those houses would be reenacted at every Roman wedding for the next 1,000 years. The Romans did not hide this connection. They wrote it down. They explained it to each other. They recorded exactly what each wedding ritual commemorated. And what they recorded is still available for anyone willing to read it. Let me show you. The morning after the seizure, Rome was quiet in a way that the settlement had never been quiet before. 700 women were behind closed doors throughout the city. They were weeping. They were refusing to eat. They were refusing to speak to the men who held them. Livy describes their resistance plainly. They struggled. They cried out for their families. They refused to participate in anything their captors offered. Romulus visited the captured women personally. He gave them a speech that Livy records in detail, and I need you to hear it because it reveals exactly how Rome intended to justify what it had done from the very beginning. He told them that what had happened was the fault of their own fathers. Their fathers' pride. Their fathers' refusal to allow intermarriage with Rome. He told them they would have all the rights of Roman wives. They would share in Roman citizenship, Roman property, Roman children. And then he said something that has echoed through 27 centuries of human history. He told them to moderate their anger and give their hearts to those to whom chance had given their bodies. Stop for a moment. Listen to what Romulus is actually saying. Give your hearts to those to whom chance has given your bodies. He is acknowledging openly that these women's bodies have already been given to Roman men without their consent. The giving has already happened. The physical fact has already been established. Now he is asking them to eventually come to love the men who took them. This is the logic of every captor who has ever told a prisoner that captivity will become comfortable if they just give it time. This is the reasoning of every abuser who has ever said you will learn to like it. And Rome encoded this logic into its founding story and celebrated it for 1,000 years. That speech did not work. The women did not simply accept because Romulus told them to. The resistance continued, and Rome needed something more permanent than speeches. Rome needed a system that would ensure that even if a woman found the opportunity to escape the law itself would prevent her from leaving. That system was called manus. Under manus marriage, the oldest and most formal type of Roman marriage, a wife passed entirely under the legal control of her husband. Everything she owned became his property. Any inheritance she might receive went to him. She had no right to divorce. She had no independent legal standing of any kind. In the eyes of Roman law, she occupied the same legal category as her husband's daughter. She was not a partner. She was a possession with a specific legal classification. The most binding form of this marriage was called confarreatio. It was reserved for the highest social class and involved the bride eating a cake of spelt grain before 10 witnesses and the high priest of Jupiter. Once this ceremony was completed, the marriage was essentially irrevocable. For centuries, there was no legal mechanism to dissolve a confarreatio marriage. None. The woman was bound for life with no exit, no appeal, no recourse. Think about why this system existed. Think about who it was designed for. Think about what problem it was built to solve. Rome had acquired 700 women through force. Those women wanted to leave. The manus system ensured that even if a woman somehow reached the door, the law would drag her back. They did not only take these women's freedom, they built a legal architecture to make sure that freedom could never be returned. And then they went further. They took what had happened on that night and they transformed every element of it into a sacred wedding ritual that would be performed at every Roman marriage for the next millennium. The Romans themselves documented these connections. Their own antiquarians and historians recorded exactly what each ritual element commemorated. This is not interpretation. This is not modern speculation. This is what the Romans said about their own traditions. The first ritual was the raptio, the seizing of the bride. At every Roman wedding, the bride was physically seized from her mother's arms by the groom's companions. This was not optional. This was not a gentle symbolic gesture. The men actually grabbed her. They actually pulled her away. She actually resisted, or at least appeared to resist. The antiquarian Festus, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, explicitly stated that this ritual commemorated the Sabine women being taken by force. He used the word raptio, seizure, taking, the same Latin root that eventually became a word I cannot say on this platform, but which you know, and which tells you exactly what was being commemorated. Every Roman bride for over 1,000 years reenacted being taken against her will. The connection to modern times is direct. The bride seized from her mother's arms, eventually softened into the father giving the bride away. The violence became symbolic. The resistance became a pleasant walk down an aisle. But the structure remained identical. A woman transferred from one man's authority to another's. Her own role in the transaction secondary to the men who give and receive. The second ritual was the carrying. Roman brides did not walk to their new homes. They were carried through the streets by the groom's companions while witnesses watched. The bride was lifted off the ground and physically transported from one location to another. Why carried? Because the Sabine women did not walk willingly to Roman houses. They were carried. They were lifted. They were transported by men who would not set them down no matter how hard they fought. The ritual carrying commemorated the physical transport of captives from the festival grounds to the houses where they would be held. I want you to picture a woman whose name was never recorded, one of the 700. She is being carried by two Roman men she has never spoken to. Her fists are striking the shoulders of the man who holds her upper body. Her feet are kicking at the air because they will not let her touch the ground. The men carrying her are laughing. The Roman crowd is cheering. She cannot see where she is being taken because the torchlight only illuminates the faces of the men around her and the darkness of the street ahead. She does not know whose house she is being delivered to. She does not know what waits for her behind the door. Now picture a modern bride lifted by her groom, carried across a threshold, set down inside their new home. The guests applaud. Everyone smiles. The gesture seems romantic. The gesture seems protective. Nobody remembers the woman whose kicking feet never touched the ground. The third ritual was the torchlight procession. Roman weddings included a procession by torchlight even when the ceremony took place during the daytime. Even under bright afternoon, sun torches were lit and carried alongside the bride as she was brought to her new home. This makes no practical sense. You do not need torches in daylight, but it makes perfect commemorative sense. The seizure of the Sabine women happened after dark. The festival ran into the evening. The operation was deliberately timed for twilight when visibility would be limited and the visitors' confusion would be maximized. The women were dragged through streets lit only by the torches their captors carried. Hercilia saw the face of the man who seized her for the first time by torchlight. That flickering, uncertain, terrifying moment when a stranger's face appeared in the fire glow, and she understood that this was the man who would control her life. Every Roman bride for 1,000 years walked through artificial darkness because the first brides were seized in real darkness. The fourth ritual was the threshold. Roman brides could not walk across the threshold of their new home. They had to be lifted over it. The groom or his companions physically raised the bride off the ground and carried her across the boundary between outside and inside. This practice survived into modern Western culture. Grooms still carry brides over thresholds today. They do it in America and in England and in countries across the world that inherited Roman tradition. They think it is romantic. They think it represents the groom's strength and the bride's grace. They think it symbolizes care and protection. They have no idea what they are actually doing. The Sabine women did not walk into those houses. They were carried across thresholds as captives being brought into captivity. The threshold was the boundary. On one side, the outside world. On the other side, the room where escape became impossible. The threshold carrying commemorated the exact moment when a door closed behind a captive woman and the world she had known ceased to be reachable. Hercilia was lifted and carried through a doorway into a room she had never seen. The door closed. The bar dropped. Outside, the screaming of other women faded into distance. That moment, that specific transition from outside to inside, from the possibility of escape to the certainty of confinement, became sacred. It became tradition. It became something a groom does to show he loves his bride. And every time it happens, the ghost of that first crossing is present in the gesture, even though no one alive remembers it. The fifth ritual was the sham resistance. Roman brides were expected to resist being taken. They were expected to cling to their mothers. They were expected to cry out and appear unwilling and show visible reluctance. A bride who went eagerly, who seemed happy to be taken, was considered improper. The correct performance required visible terror. Why would any civilization require its brides to perform terror? Because the original brides were genuinely terrified. The Sabine women actually resisted. They actually cried out. They actually clung to their families as they were pried away by force. Their genuine terror became the template for ritual terror. Their real screams became the model for expected screams. For 1,000 years, every Roman bride performed the trauma of women who had actually lived it. The screaming was scripted, but the first screams were real. The sixth ritual was the word. During Roman wedding processions, witnesses called out a specific word, telesio. By the classical period, nobody knew what this word meant. Roman scholars debated its origins for centuries without reaching consensus. But the oldest explanation, the one that Livy himself recorded, connects it directly to the night of the seizure. During the mass taking, according to Livy, a group of common Roman men was carrying an exceptionally beautiful woman through the streets. They were stopped by other Romans who demanded to know who they were taking her for. The men shouted that she was for Telesius, a well-known and respected man. This answer satisfied the questioners. The beautiful woman was delivered to Telesius, and the marriage was considered particularly fortunate. The word telesio, shouted at every Roman wedding for 1,000 years, commemorated the moment when men carrying a seized woman established their authority over her by naming her designated owner. 1,000 years of wedding guests shouting a word whose meaning they had forgotten. A word that originally meant she belongs to him. A word that was first spoken on a dark street by men carrying a struggling woman to a house where a stranger was waiting. 6 rituals, 6 direct connections to a single night of mass seizure. The seizing, the carrying, the torchlight, the threshold, the resistance, the ownership claim. Every element of the Roman wedding traced back to what happened to approximately 700 women on that night. Festus wrote about these connections. Varro discussed them. Plutarch analyzed them. The information was available in the ancient world to anyone who bothered to read it. What was hidden was not the facts. What was hidden was the horror. The Roman sources presented these connections as interesting antiquarian trivia rather than as evidence that an entire civilization was commemorating its founding crime every time 2 people got married. They explained what the rituals meant without pausing to consider what it meant that the rituals existed at all. But the rituals were only half of the machine. The other half was the story Rome told about what happened, and that story was designed with the same precision as the military operation itself. Rome spent the next 1,000 years constructing a narrative around the mass seizure, and that narrative relied on specific techniques that I need you to see clearly because they are still used today by every institution that needs to transform a crime into a tradition. The first technique was emphasizing eventual consent. Every Roman account of the Sabine women stresses that they eventually loved their captors. They eventually accepted Roman identity. They eventually became so loyal to their new families that they would die rather than see those families destroyed. But this emphasis on eventual consent serves a very specific function. It confirms that initial consent was absent. You do not need to stress that someone eventually agreed unless they initially refused. The very structure of the narrative reveals what it is trying to deny. When Livy says the women eventually gave their hearts, he is admitting they did not give their hearts at a first. The narrative cannot help confessing the truth it is trying to cover. The second technique was emphasizing necessity. The sources explain again and again that Rome had no alternative. The neighbors refused intermarriage. The city would have died without women. The seizure was regrettable but unavoidable. What choice did Romulus have? This is the logic every aggressor uses. We had no choice. They forced us to do this. Our survival required their suffering. And it is a logic that ignores every alternative. Rome could have offered better terms. Rome could have proven itself trustworthy over years of patient diplomacy. Rome could have accepted that the neighbor's rejection was justified, given the character of its population. Rome could have tried anything other than mass seizure. Rome chose to take what it could not earn and then claimed it had no choice because the only alternative was to not get what it wanted. The third technique was silence. Silence about the women who never accommodated. The sources mention briefly, almost in passing, that some women never reconciled to their situation. Women who continued to mourn. Women who refused to eat, refused to speak, refused to participate. Women who resisted in ways the sources do not describe. Women who did not survive the first weeks, the first months. These women received no names, they have no stories. They appear in the historical record only as a category to be mentioned and immediately dismissed before the narrative returns to the women who supposedly found happiness. How many women never accepted? How many died in those early days? How many lived for years in silent resistance that no Roman historian thought worth recording? We cannot know. Rome did not preserve those stories. Rome did not even count the women accurately. The sources say 30 or several hundred or approximately 700. They could not agree on a number because they did not count precisely. They counted grain. They counted soldiers. They counted weapons and horses and bushels of wheat. They did not count the women because the women were not individuals to be counted. They were a resource to be acquired. That absence tells you everything about who the women were to Rome, and it tells you everything about who controlled the records. But the Sabine fathers had not forgotten. They had gone home from that festival in shock and grief. They had gathered their warriors. They had sent messages to every people who had lost women that night. And within months, a coalition was forming. Armies were assembling. An alliance united by shared fury and shared loss was preparing to march on Rome and take back what had been taken from them. The smaller tribes moved first. The Cannonenses, acting alone, attacked Rome before the larger alliance was ready. It was a mistake born of impatience and grief. Romulus met them in battle and destroyed them. He killed their king, a man named Acron, in single combat. He stripped the dead king's armor and weapons and carried them back to Rome, where he hung them on an oak tree on the Capitoline Hill. This was the first spolia opima, the highest military honor a Roman warrior could achieve, awarded only to a commander who killed an enemy commander in hand-to-hand combat. Romulus built his reputation on the body of a father who had come to rescue his daughter. The Antemnates attacked next, defeated, absorbed into Rome. The Crustumerians followed, defeated, absorbed. Each time Romulus won and then swallowed the defeated people into the Roman population. Rome grew larger after every battle. A pattern was establishing itself. Attack Rome, lose, become Roman. The very armies sent to punish Rome for its crime became fuel for Rome's growth. The Sabines watched. They were the largest of the neighboring peoples, and they had lost the most women. But they were patient. They had seen what happened to the tribes that attacked separately. They would not make that mistake. The Sabines waited. They gathered the largest army Rome had yet faced, and they had something the smaller tribes did not have. They had a way inside the walls. Her name was Tarpeia. She was the daughter of Spurius Tarpeius, the Roman commander in charge of the garrison on the Capitoline Hill, one of the most important defensive positions in the settlement. Tarpeia looked out from the walls and saw the Sabine army camped below. She saw the golden bracelets and heavy gold arm rings that the Sabine warriors wore on their left arms. Wealth beyond anything a Roman woman could expect in this rough settlement of outcasts, and she made a decision that would echo through Roman history for centuries. She sent a message to the Sabine commanders. She would open the gates of the Capitoline if they gave her what they wore on their left arms. She meant the gold. The Sabines agreed. In the darkness of night, Tarpeia opened the gates. The Sabine army poured through. They seized the Capitoline Hill, one of the two key positions in Rome. The advantage shifted dramatically, and then the Sabines turned to Tarpeia to pay her price. She had asked for what they wore on their left arms. She expected gold bracelets. Instead, the Sabine warriors unstrapped the heavy bronze shields they carried on their left arms and hurled them at her. Shield after shield crashed down on Tarpeia until the weight crushed her. She died beneath the shields of the men she had betrayed her own people to help. And here is what matters about this story for the people listening. Tarpeia was despised by both sides. Rome hated her as a traitor who had sold the city's defenses for gold. The Sabines despised her because even an enemy recognizes the ugliness of someone who sells their own people for personal gain. The cliff where she died, or where her body was thrown afterward, became known as the Tarpeian Rock. For centuries afterward, Rome executed its worst criminals by throwing them from that cliff. Murderers, traitors, the vilest offenders Rome could produce were killed on the rock named for the woman who had opened the gates. Her name became a synonym for treachery and for the punishment that treachery earns. Both sides agreed on one thing: some betrayals deserve what they get. But now Rome was in genuine danger. The Sabines held the Capitoline. The Romans held the Palatine. Between the two hills lay a marshy valley, a low stretch of waterlogged ground that would one day become the Forum Romanum, the political heart of the greatest empire the ancient world would produce. But on this day, it was a battlefield. The two armies clashed in that valley. The fighting was savage. Fathers who had come to rescue daughters fought against men who were fighting to keep the women they had seized. The Sabine warrior Metius Curtius led a devastating charge that drove the Roman lines backward. He nearly broke through entirely. His horse plunged into the marshy ground and became trapped, and Metio barely escaped with his life. The spot where he nearly drowned would be remembered for centuries as the Lacus Curtius, a monument in the center of the Forum, marking where a Sabine warrior almost defeated Rome itself. The Romans counterattacked. Hostus Hostilius, the man who had seized Hersilia, the man who had carried her across the threshold of a house that was not her home, fought at the front of the Roman line. The sources record that he fought with extraordinary courage. They also record that he was killed. Hostus Hostilius died in the battle between Rome and the Sabines, struck down in the marshy ground of what would become the Forum. And in a single moment, Hersilia's world shifted again. The man who had seized her was dead. The man who Roman law called her husband was gone. She was carrying his child, or had already given birth to a child who bore his blood. She was a widow of a man she had never chosen to marry, a mother to a child conceived in captivity, and her father was on the other side of the battlefield fighting to reach her, perhaps not knowing that the man who had taken her was already dead. The battle raged. Men fell on both sides. Neither army retreated. The fighting pushed back and forth across the marshy ground, blood mixing with swamp water, the screaming of wounded men filling the valley between the hills. It was becoming clear that this battle would not end until one side was annihilated. Rome or the Sabines, one would survive, one would be destroyed, and then something happened that Rome would celebrate for the next 2,000 years as one of the most glorious moments in its founding history. Something that has been painted by the greatest artists of the Renaissance and the Baroque. Something that has been held up as proof that everything that happened was ultimately redeemed. It was none of those things. It was the most heartbreaking moment in the entire story. And it has been completely misunderstood. The captured women broke through the lines. They ran onto the battlefield. They ran between the two armies with their hair disheveled, their clothing torn and their faces showing extremity of distress that made both armies pause. Some of them carried infants in their arms, the children born from their forced unions, the children who were the entire purpose of what Rome had done. Hersilia was among them. She may have been carrying the child of Hostus Hostilius, the child of the man who had just been killed, fighting against her own father. She stood in the space between two armies belonging to both sides and to neither, connected by blood and by violence to men on each side of the line. Livy records the words the women spoke, and I need you to hear them clearly because these words have been celebrated for millennia as proof that the women forgave what had been done to them. They are not proof of forgiveness. They are proof of something much darker. The women cried out, "If you cannot accept the bond between you, turn your anger against us. We are the cause of this war. We are the reason for wounds and death. Better for us to die than to live as widows or orphans without one or the other of you." Listen to what they are actually saying. Better to die than to watch their birth families and their captors kill each other. Better to die than to be widows of men who seized them, or orphans of fathers who could not save them. They are not expressing love. They are not expressing acceptance. They are not expressing forgiveness. They are expressing the mathematics of impossible circumstances. After months of captivity, after being forced into unions, they did not choose after bearing children by men who had seized them at a religious festival. These women had been placed in a position where every outcome was devastating. Their fathers might win the battle and kill the fathers of their children. Their captors might win and kill their fathers and brothers. Whoever won the women would lose someone they loved. This was not reconciliation. This was what coercion produces when it succeeds completely. This is what happens when captives have been so thoroughly entangled with their captors that liberation itself becomes a form of loss. The women did not stop the battle because they were happy. They did not run onto the battlefield because they had forgiven what had been done to them. They stopped the war because they had no good options left, and stopping the killing was the least terrible of the terrible choices available to them. Their intervention was not acceptance. It was desperation transformed into diplomacy because desperation was all they had left. The armies paused. Both sides lowered their weapons. The women's words hung in the air between them. And then negotiations began. Romulus and the Sabine king Titus Tatius met between the lines. They agreed to merge their peoples into a single community. The Sabines would become Romans. The two cultures would blend. The two kings would rule jointly. The war would end. And the women whose intervention had made peace possible, they were not freed. They were not given the choice to return to their families. Their captivity did not end with the treaty. What ended was the possibility that anyone might rescue them. The merger meant that the Sabine families were absorbed into Rome. There was no longer a separate Sabine community to escape to. The captives and their captors' communities became one society, which meant the captivity became invisible. The women could not be prisoners of their own people, but they were still in houses they had not chosen. They were still living lives that had been forced upon them. The only thing that had changed was that the world had rearranged itself so that their captivity looked like belonging. Rome celebrated this merger. Rome named the 30 voting districts, the curiae, the fundamental units of Roman political organization after the captured women. 30 curiae for what tradition said were 30 women, though the actual number was much higher. This has been presented for centuries as an honor, as Rome recognizing the women, and as tribute to their role in making peace possible. But think about what it actually was. The women were not freed. They were not compensated. They were not given authority or agency or any meaningful choice about their own lives. They were given their names on political abstractions, voting districts, administrative categories. This is how systems of power operate. They name institutions after their victims. They create memorials and tributes and commemorations. And then they point to those honors as evidence that the victims were respected, that the crime was forgiven, that everyone ended up satisfied. The curiae were not a gift to the women. They were a gift to Rome. They allowed Rome to claim that the women were honored and integrated and celebrated, while the women themselves remained in exactly the same houses, under exactly the same legal control, living exactly the same lives they had been forced into. The naming erased the crime by covering it in celebration, and the women who never accepted, the women who continued to mourn their old lives, the women who refused to eat, refused to speak, refused to participate in the households of their captors, the women who did not survive the early months. They disappeared from the record entirely. No names, no stories, no acknowledgement beyond a passing mention that some women found it difficult to adjust. Rome did not preserve their stories because remembering them would have complicated the narrative that everyone was happy in the end. But they existed. Their resistance was real. Their suffering was real. Their absence from the historical record is not evidence that they did not matter. It is evidence of who controlled the records. And Hercilia, what happened to the woman whose story has carried us through the founding crime of Rome? She lived out her life in the city that had trapped her. The widow of Hostus Hostilius, the mother of a child born from a union she did not choose, the daughter of a Sabine father who was now, through the bitter arithmetic of merger, a Roman citizen living in the same city as the men who had taken his daughter. The sources describe Hercilia as influential, as respected, as a founding mother whose name was remembered. They do not describe her as happy. They describe her as present. That is not the same thing. After her death, Hercilia was deified. She became Hora or Hora Carini, a goddess associated with marriage. Future generations of Roman brides prayed to her. They asked her to bless their unions with happiness and fertility and harmony. They prayed to a woman who had been seized at a festival and never given the choice to go home. They prayed to a goddess whose divine status was built on a foundation of human suffering that had been transformed through centuries of storytelling into something sacred. The women who prayed did not know what Hercilia had actually experienced. By the time she became a goddess, the story had been reshaped so many times that the original experience was unrecognizable. Hercilia had become a symbol of marital harmony, not a victim of marital violence. The transformation was complete. The woman remained in the story, but the meaning of her story had been inverted. She meant the opposite of what her life had actually been. This was the final theft, not her body, not her freedom, not her legal rights, her identity. They took who Hercilia was, a woman who had been seized against her will, and forced into a life she did not choose, and they turned her into a symbol of the very institution that had consumed her. They made her a goddess of marriage. They made captivity sacred. And then they made future captives pray to her without understanding what they were praying to. The other women, the ones whose names were not preserved, faded into the population. They bore children. Their children married other Romans. Their grandchildren were simply Roman with no memory of which ancestor had been a captive and which had been a captor. The crime dissolved into demographics. When everyone is descended from both sides, no one is responsible for either side. The founding violence was distributed across so many bloodlines that it became invisible. This too was a form of forgetting. The women were absorbed so thoroughly that they could no longer be identified as a separate group. Their suffering became the general foundation rather than the specific injustice. Rome was built on what was done to them. But Rome eventually became them, and they became Rome, and the distinction disappeared. Only the rituals remained, the rituals that commemorated what had happened, the rituals that continued to be performed even when no one remembered what they commemorated, the rituals that were transmitted from Rome to the cultures that inherited Roman tradition, the rituals that crossed centuries and continents and oceans, the rituals that are still performed today. The explicit seizure of the bride from her mother's arms softened over the centuries into the father giving the bride away. The torchlight procession became candles at evening ceremonies. The specific words were forgotten, but other elements persisted with barely any modification at all. The carrying of the bride over the threshold survived into medieval Europe, and from there into modern Western culture, and from there into wedding traditions around the world. It survived because no one remembered what it meant. It persisted because it seemed romantic. A strong groom lifting a delicate bride, a gesture of protection, a symbol of new beginnings. It is none of those things. It is the echo of a door closing behind a captive woman in a city that had revealed itself as a trap. It is the last gesture of the first night, the moment when outside became inside, and freedom became confinement, and a woman who had come to a festival was sealed into a life she had not chosen. She came to a festival on a summer morning. She never went home. She was seized by men she had never met, carried to a house she had never seen, and lived out her life in a city that turned her suffering into a wedding tradition and her memory into a goddess that future brides prayed to without knowing her story. 27 centuries later, a groom bends down and lifts his bride. He carries her across the threshold. The guests applaud. The photographer captures the moment. Everyone smiles. Nobody remembers Hercilia, but her story is still being told. In every lifted bride, in every given away daughter, in every threshold crossed without understanding what crossing it once meant. The screaming stopped centuries ago. The rituals never did. Now you know what they commemorate, and you will never unsee it.